Happy Tuesday, everyone, and welcome to Live Weather Impact Plus. I don't know if we ever decided yesterday, Lily, what the name was because I just introduced it as Live Weather Impact, but here we are. Today was officially the hottest day of the year so far. The actual air temperature only got to 98. I say only because, we were looking for that target of 100, but hey, no complaints when it's cooler than expected. But the heat index did unfortunately hit 105, which is the threshold for a heat advisory. It was the forecast for today as well. So very warm, very humid. Good news is that we only have one more day where we want folks to stay especially weather aware, weather alert, and that is tomorrow. And it's actually going to be a bit of a different day than today, more of a 1-2 punch, as we actually are going to be tracking heat first and then storms. First, we're going to talk about today. I just mentioned this a second ago, but 98 for the second day in a row, making it tied again for the hottest day of the year so far. I'm still saying today was hotter just because of the fact that the heat index was hotter than the 101 we had yesterday. Tomorrow, rinse, repeat. We're going to probably hit 98 again, and then we're starting to see a more typical classic summer-like pattern for Thursday, Friday, and heading into the weekend. Right now, it still feels like 103. We will likely still feel in the triple digits until we get to sunset. Typically, this time of year when we have heat this high, we're sitting at right around 99, if not 100, just before sunset. Then we will start to see temperatures drop off. Unfortunately, with a low temperature tonight of 77, we'll probably still feel like the 80s all throughout the night. I wanted to show the peak heat index for some of our local areas today. So again, we had 105 there in Charlotte. I'm actually going to take this off for a second, do this manually, because I want to show folks in Chirac. There was a certain point just after 2:30 that we were near 110. Some of the highest numbers in Lincolnton earlier, 107. We had the same there for Rock Hill and over toward Albemarle. So even if you didn't hit that 107, 108, 110 in Charlotte, we still felt it in some of our more rural communities. And I do get questions sometimes about the fact that we technically have the urban heat island effect here in Charlotte, but sometimes the heat index is hotter in other areas. Well, normally the urban heat island effect is mostly for the city center, which is not where the data comes from. That comes from Charlotte Douglas International, which I know we talked about a little bit yesterday. So yes, the urban heat island effect does affect the air temperature, impact the air temperature and the heat index, but more rural communities oftentimes can be impacted, especially south and southeast of Charlotte, based on where the positioning of the high is. So just be mindful of that. Again, tomorrow we're looking at 105, 104 for the highest heat index, but that doesn't mean some of those outlying areas couldn't once again have higher numbers than what we see in the Queen City. We were not completely storm-free today, but the storms only impacted the mountains. We actually had a severe thunderstorm warning earlier for the higher little tip there of Avery County, just near the Beach Mountain area and north and west of there. But now that's pushing off into Tennessee. We have some lightning strikes here, but again, not a lot of impacts in our actual viewing area. Although sometimes just over the border in Wilkes County in North Carolina, over in Tennessee, some of those areas near Bristol can sometimes get WCNC, and maybe they have WCNC Plus downloaded, so we're still going to talk about them nonetheless. No storms for the rest of today, at least for the Charlotte area, but tomorrow, this is kind of where the 1-2 punch comes in. We'll still see heat index values around 105, and then just around 2 o'clock, we'll start to see a few thunderstorms pop up. Now, a lot of these model runs earlier today, yesterday, were very, very aggressive with the sea breeze collision. Now, I think they're kind of coming more so back to reality because we have not had storms for the past few days, so the flooding risk won't be quite as high, but also just the fact that with the heat and humidity and the high pressure overhead, I just wouldn't expect that much storm activity. I was talking with this earlier to Lily as well, our heat weather intern. Yes, could eat my words, but at least for now, I would expect that scattered storms will be possible, but again, not necessarily to the higher threshold. I say that because I know there's a lot of data that gets posted randomly with just 1 or 2 runs. And so at this point, I do not think we're going to be quite that high when it comes to rain and storm potential, but yes, we will have some nonetheless. So that's 4 o'clock. Here's 5, 6, and 7, 8. Again, a few more storms possible by 8, and then after that we are largely dry. More of a rinse repeat forecast on Thursday in terms of a few isolated storms after 12 o'clock, but again, nothing to the threshold of what we had a few weeks ago when we had that widespread flash flooding with the training storms. We could have a few heavy downpours, a few areas of lightning strikes, but again, nothing to that threshold. So heat number 1 impact tomorrow. With the storms, gusty winds near 60 miles an hour will be second, and then we will have the risk for some small hail. Again, flooding risk is there just if the same side kind of sees that same storm sit over there for long periods of time, but I would not expect that to be a high risk by any stretch of the imagination. Here's the 3-day heat impact, of course, put out by the National Weather Service. Again, today, tomorrow, we're looking at major to extreme impacts, and you can see how quickly that drops off as we get toward Thursday. So here's the latest 5-day forecast. 105 tomorrow, still under a heat advisory. We slowly drop down to the upper 90s to near 100 as we get closer to the weekend. We're going to take a quick look at that 7-day forecast, and then we're going to talk about something else that happened today, which was something happening in the tropics. So there's 98 tomorrow. Weather alert still in effect because we have that heat index near 105, and then the secondary risk of storms. But you can see the rest of the week heading into the weekend is more typical pattern for this time of year. So let's transition to tropical weather. So 2025 Atlantic hurricane season did pop off on June 1st. There are often times where we will see an early season storm. That did not happen this year. There were many, many years, a few years ago, that we did have early season storms to where the NWS, NHC, World Meteorological Organization was thinking, maybe we should start it on May 15th. But it's just the fact that most of the time that doesn't happen, so they're going to stick with June 1st. So June 1st through November 30th, we have the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season. Andrea is officially taken. We had a tropical storm that formed earlier today. It is way out in the center part of the Atlantic Ocean and is no impact not only to the United States, but no impact to land as well. One important thing I do want to point out here is I had some viewers commenting on a post I made about this the other day on Facebook, asking why the WMO names storms that aren't going to impact the U.S. land in general. Well, the answer is because the storm happened, whether or not it impacts us. It's like the old saying, if a tree falls in the forest, does nobody hear it if nobody's there? The storm still formed, whether it impacts land or not. It can also impact things like upwelling. So when a storm moves over warm ocean waters, it can bring in the cooler water from below. So we also want to just be aware of that, when it comes to future forecasting of storms. While I don't think upwelling would be a major issue out here in the central part of the Atlantic, it is still something that we, of course, track. And eventually, sometimes tropical systems can become extratropical, post-tropical, and eventually can impact somebody else. So nonetheless, first storm can be crossed off for the Atlantic hurricane season. I do just want to remind folks that your average for named storms is 14, average hurricanes is 7, average major is 3, and NHC, Colorado State, as well as NC State all have an above average hurricane season expected because of that teeter-totter back and forth between La Nada and La Nina. Right now, CSU does have about a 35 to 46% chance that we could see a hurricane impact and or make landfall along the Carolina coast. But I know Chief Meteorologist Brad Panovich talks about this a lot. We talked about it before his hurricane presentation a few weeks ago. Oftentimes here in the Charlotte area, we are more impacted by storms that make landfall somewhere along the Gulf Coast of Florida or along the Big Bend. And this year, CSU calls for a 65% chance of that. So again, just things that our team continues to monitor as we get further and further into the hurricane season. So recap of what happened today. We got a lot of heat. Did we hit 100? The answer is no. 98 for the second day in a row. Still, again, under a weather alert tomorrow, still under a heat advisory. That is for heat number 1, then gusty winds for storms, and then that small hail potential. Again, hurricane season forecast expected to be above average. First storm of 2025. And that's about all, at least for now, the local weather that we do have. Now, as we get closer to tomorrow, we again mentioned the fact that we do have a lot of heat. Brad just sent a message out. He is just the best. He's always keeping a close eye on what's going on. Okay,
the man is truly never off.
I know, seriously. Literally. I mean, I guess he's technically at our hurricane, at an AMS conference. So I guess technically, he is still working, I guess, for lack of a better term, but that is still interesting nonetheless. Okay, so we're gonna switch gears here. In just a second, I gotta pull up this thing that James sent me a few weeks ago. There we go.
I can watch the radar up, Brittany, while you're loading that up to show you some of those continued storms. Did you see just outside Asheville, there was a severe thunderstorm warning?
Yeah, that actually one has been sitting over us for what feels like forever.
Yeah.
So annoying. Okay, all right, we're popped up.
I will let curious viewers know that message from Brad was telling us that Columbia, South Carolina experienced a lightning strike, even though it's not raining there. Bolt from the blue.
Yes, it was. And actually, Becca Bertzel did a story about that earlier on lightning safety. It does seem like the data says that lightning safety is getting better. People are paying attention more. I would love to think that's the National Weather Service's when thunder roars, move indoors, that people are paying attention to more. But nonetheless, it is getting better. Will be clear, I did not see this data myself. But the old data said that lightning strike deaths, it was normally, what was it, 80% men, 20% women. Chris Mulcahy told me that number has gone down to 77% men and 23% women. And so he looked at me the other day and he said, "We're getting better." I said,
We heard
"Okay."
you loud and clear.
Yeah, but I mean, I hope that's the case. But deaths in general are going down, so very thankful for that. Okay, we're going to switch gears here because a few weeks ago we had widespread flooding in Charlotte. We had high water rescues, and then my gosh, the days just run together. Last Thursday, we had severe flooding in portions of Caldwell County that had some people reporting, waist deep water in their neck of the woods. And so we have a very special guest with us today to talk about flooding. This is Alex Moore. He's with Charlotte Stormwater Services. Used to work with one of my favorite people, John Wendell, who used to be a meteorologist here for 18 years. What's up, Alex? How are you doing today?
I'm great. I was really disappointed we didn't hit 100 though, to
Me
be
too.
honest.
Honestly.
Yeah, but I guess we're kind of in the minority of that group, to be honest. But it's a meteorologist thing, I think.
Yeah. I also think too, it's one of those things where it's like the data and the threshold that you want to hit first more than anything versus like we don't actually want people to be more impacted by the heat because 98 and a dew point of 72, where you go to 100, it's probably going to feel worse. But it's just the stat itself, especially since it's so rare. Okay, so you were a TV meteorologist. That's what Lily told me.
Yes.
So you know the drill. You know
I
the
do.
deal.
I know them all.
I was telling her that earlier, but she was talking about getting you in and stuff. I was like, I mean, he'll know. He's been to a TV station before. But now you've transitioned to working for Charlotte Stormwater Services. So if anybody is not familiar with what Stormwater Services does, can you give us a little recap of kind of what your job is specifically, but also what Stormwater Services does in general?
I can thank John Wendell for this too, because he was a great coach. I moved into his position, so that helped out a lot. Shout out to John. So Stormwater Services, it covers a few different departments, county and city, and then we have some partnerships with Park and Recs and other departments as well across the county. But for the county ourselves, we are strictly in stream restoration and creek restoration in terms of water quality and flood mitigation inside the county. So we can go up to Davidson or down to Pineville, but we're strictly sticking with just the streams and creeks when it comes to any sort of infrastructure, any emergency management stuff that's kind of out of ours into the cities. But when it comes to certain projects that have to do with all of the creeks around Mecklenburg County, I can guarantee you we've got our hands involved in that, in both water quality and flood mitigation.
And part of that flood mitigation, this is actually not one of the questions I wrote down, but I just remember doing this story with John a few years ago. But you guys also will help, maybe not be the main person, but you guys will help kind of influence, or help with when the city will do like buybacks of certain lands and things like that are in floodplains that flood often. I believe that's correct, right? Because I know John was talking about that a few years ago. So if you have an area in Charlotte that sees a lot of flooding and you have to do buybacks or things like that, you guys do help sometimes.
Correct. That's actually a big thing we did, even though I wasn't there during Helene last fall. John went out there and the whole emergency team, along with all of our flood mitigation team on the county and the city side, since it was an all hands on deck situation out there near the dam. After all the water settled and after we got all the assessments and the data from the damage, we were able to pinpoint certain levels of, I guess, they call it the new level of the floodplain out there on the river. It's just the Helene-based thing. Everywhere else in the county is still based off of the data that we usually get with rainfall rates and the flood stage levels. But when it came to the Mountain Island area, I think we've already gotten 23 homes purchased. And then we have a handful under contract as well, just from that area and just from that event alone. Throughout, I would say the last handful of years, the biggest thing we've tried to do is pull those residents out of the floodplain by buyouts or retrofit. That's been a program we just started a few years ago. People can, if they're in a floodplain, they can apply to have their home retrofitted, which means it could be lifted to the floodplain. There's certain things where, like your AC unit or the externals or any of the electronics, if they're below that floodplain, you can apply to have them lifted and maybe put in the attic or somewhere that's not necessarily flood prone. So one of the bigger things that we do, and it goes as far as our community rating system, now that we're a class 2, a lot of that is because we're pulling residential and businesses out of the floodplain. Or if they're, it's private property, if they don't want to move out of the floodplain, we can't force them, obviously. If they want to live there, we just want to at least give them the information about their risk. So our biggest thing is making sure that properties in the floodplain either know their risk and know what they're getting themselves into, or if they have been flooded out, we do, especially if FEMA comes in and declares everything a disaster, then it's even a bigger case of trying to get those houses either repaired or bought out so we can just turn it into open space and turn it into green space. So that gives us points, and then those points go towards flood insurance premium deductions. It's just a fun little circle that it's been a wild ride to learn, but it's a lot of information, and I think it's very important to a lot of people who are at risk for flooding, even if it's long-term flooding or short-term like flash flooding.
Yeah, and so when it comes to Charlotte's increased urbanization and someone who maybe has no idea about floodplains and like how those can change, so you're mentioning retrofitting a home by trying to lift it or something, how does Charlotte's increasing urbanization maybe impact the way that floodplains do and have and could eventually change? Like, does that have any kind of impact on how that can happen?
Well, it does come down to almost a case-by-case basis. There are certain situations where we can buy out houses in open floodplains. One of the projects that we kind of talk about in that sense is Little Sugar Creek down by Park Road Shopping Center. The creek behind it, we bought out a handful of homes. This was a little while ago. I don't think it was super recent, but bought those homes out, restored the whole entire section of Little Sugar Creek in that area to have better water flow and water quality, so that downstream they wouldn't see the effects of the flooding. And over time, that's just become a less flood prone area, because the open space in the open area has helped the water flow slow down instead of rush to where it collects, and then it just becomes a big pool. A lot of the projects that we're doing around town, even in the future and in the past, have all been in that same kind of template, where we want to redo the creek, spread it out, give it more of that more area so that the water can seep into the ground. It's not parking lot, it's not roads and stuff like that where it's impervious and the water is going to collect a lot more in sense of those bigger parking lots and those bigger areas. But what we're trying to do is make sure that when we find these areas that are flood prone, we're not buying the properties out and then reselling the properties. We're keeping them emptied out. So if some, Walmart, for instance, for just an example, if they come in and they build a big parking lot, then that's just going to get a massive area of just impervious surface that's going to make it tougher for water to run off, and it's going to collect even more in certain areas. So going forward, I think, with the urbanization and the growth of Charlotte, it comes down to more what are the areas that have flood-prone tendencies, and are those areas where can we help out in that sense from the county side? The city side also has their data and their information, whether they can help out one way or the other. But we work together with the city and in Parks and Rec to do a lot of these projects to make sure the community understands what's going on and why we're doing certain things. One of the projects that we're actually about to start is out at Kings Branch, and the goal afterwards will be to pull a lot of these apartment complexes out of the floodplain by restoring the creek itself. So they won't have to move, we won't have to buy out, they won't have to do anything, and just naturally by restoring that creek, we will pull those apartments out of the floodplain. So that's like the we wish it could all be that easy, and we wish it could be that simple. And it does come down to a dollars and cents situation and the design. Can it be functional? Can we afford it? And can it last too? We want these things to last. We want them to look good, and we want this to be a positive thing for the community.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to know. It's not you guys just coming in after a flood has happened or after the same spot has been flooded 20 times. There's also a lot of like mitigation and preparing that goes into that. And I know that area very well, and I know James does too, because the Little Sugar Creek Greenway there, even a few weeks ago, I think Amelie's gets flooded a lot when there's a lot of heavy rain down there
Sure
in Park
does.
Road. Oh, I love that place, but you know, they flood like crazy, it seems. Okay, so you mentioned this a little bit, but balancing kind of the infrastructure of Charlotte and its growth, how has that been? Like, and what are your kind of main challenges between, you know, trying to balance the infrastructure, the stormwater growth, even just the city growth in general? I mean, you see all the apartments going up all the time. So there's always some kind of project happening. But with the city that's growing so much, I'm sure there's some challenges that have come in between the two. So what are some of those that maybe you've noticed since you took over for John a few months ago?
Well, from my side, since I'm fresh,
Yeah.
I am a rookie.
You have a fresh perspective.
So when it comes to I would kind of put that under the category of like the infrastructure side of things. That is on the city side. So they're the ones that take the control of things that has to do with anything essentially but the streams and creeks. And so what I've noticed over the last 4 or 5 months, and of course we've really only had one or maybe two real true flooding events in that time frame that I've been around. A lot of it is really, what I've learned is that the rainfall where the rainfall happens isn't necessarily going to show you where the flooding down creek is going to exactly be. And that's been a fun actual puzzle to kind of put together, because as we saw, you know, a week and a half ago, there were probably 4 or 5 different spots around town that saw flooding, and they were all for various reasons, whatever that may be. Since I'm new, I'm not quite, you know, the guys who have been there like Wendell for long term, they've seen these things for 15, 20 years, so they know these more flood prone areas. But when it comes to just the overall infrastructure of everything, it's up to the city to decide what's most important, and then we just kind of follow suit when it comes to that stuff. And then vice versa, when it's streams and creeks, we take the lead on it, and then the city kind of will jump in along with Parks and Recs with the greenways and all of those things. So it's hard to pinpoint one thing, because I realize that there's so many streams and creeks in the Charlotte area. I mean, it's almost overwhelming. I'm still learning the different names of them and which ones are the big projects or the hot spots. It's almost like they've got their own personality, each spot around the city. And what we want to do is make sure that we're not wasting taxpayer dollars on projects that aren't going to yield those results from the county and the city side. We want to make sure that whatever we're doing going forward is beneficial for the community, and it's also going to keep people safe and keep people out of those flood-prone areas if we can get them convinced, you know.
Well, I know the city of Charlotte, and just in general, was very, very particular, you know, when they built the greenways and kind of trying to make sure everything helped with flood mitigation. You know, they took issues that maybe other big cities across the Southeast had and tried to be better. So they took a lot of very, very specific precautions for that reason. But I know they're always trying to build new greenways and things like that. So how does adding a new greenway, or maybe revitalizing a greenway, to someone who knows nothing about flooding or flood mitigation, how does that contribute to managing stormwater and reducing flooding for maybe other areas? Because if maybe someone is not familiar with the greenway, I mean, how the heck do they work?
So the greenway situation is more of a community situation. It doesn't affect any of the floodplain itself.
Gotcha.
All of the floodplain mitigation is going to be done in the stream and creek itself. Most of the time it's because there's blockages from down trees. There's the restrictions to the flow is what the problem is, and that creates the flooding or the abundance of flooding. When we go in and fix the stream, we flatten it out. We take the edges of the banks and we kind of make them a little flatter, and then we'll help with the recycling of those trees. We'll put them up, we'll bury them in the ground, and then once we're done, Parks and Rec will come in, and then there's a 50-foot-ish buffer zone, and then they'll just put a a nice little path along there, and they'll put some signs down and they'll have a great time. So it's really more of just a community boost for recreational purposes. It really doesn't have anything to do with the actual flood mitigation itself.
Gotcha, that makes sense. Okay, so you have been fantastic. We don't have a ton of time left, but what I did want to ask you right before we go is that if people begin to see significant flooding in their area, what are precautions they can do to stay safe? If they hear of a flooding risk, like what are things that they can do in the near term, the long term to kind of mitigate their risk?
Well, majority of people who already know their flood risk have lived there and they've seen it, they've experienced it. So in that case, it's just knowing your risk, having flood insurance, and knowing that home insurance isn't going to replace that flood insurance. So it's a big thing to get on that flood insurance ahead of time, because it still takes 30 days to kick in. And then for new people coming in, we have tools with the county. Our 3D floodplain mapping will show you exactly the FEMA floodplain, so you can see if your resident is in that floodplain, and it'll tell you what kind of event you need for it to be flooded, to get flooded. So we have useful tools on our Mecklenburg website, the Stormwater Services. You can check those out. And our FINS, our Flood Information Notification System, is awesome. If it's ever a rainy event, you can go to that and you can see exactly where rainfall totals and the stream levels are as well.
Yeah, it's cool too because you can go back and see like what it looks like when there's no rain and then what it looks like now that it's super rainy. So thanks so much, Alex, for being here. We really appreciate it, and you are welcome back anytime to talk all about floodwater, especially as we get closer to the anniversary of Helene. So thanks so much for being here.
Welcome.
Well, guys, that is all I have for your Tuesday version of Live Weather Impact Plus. We will be back here tomorrow talking more storms, more heat. Stay safe, stay weather aware, and I'll see you tomorrow.